for everybody, whether young or old, as they approach the end of life, there are big questions, or at the very least nagging questions that come along, which deserve addressing and deserve to be heard and deserve to be responded to, even if the response that comes from the person sitting and listening with them is just to acknowledge how big they are, and to recognise that there might not be anything that that individual who sits with the person who's dying can do. Big questions of all kinds arise. In a religious setting, of course, there is always the question, is there a God? If there is a heaven, what's heaven like? Will I get into heaven at all? In a religious context, from my perspective, it's important to acknowledge the depth and quality of the question that's asked, and to be able to respond to it, not by giving a glib answer and saying something, well, of course, Jesus loves everybody. Everybody gets into heaven if you believe in Jesus. But to enable somebody to actually say, I'm not sure about this Christianity thing. I've been to church for 40 years, but as it comes towards death, I'm just feeling a bit lost. And enabling somebody and allowing somebody to really have a sense of being able to have someone sit with them or stand alongside them, to hear it and to respond. So sometimes I will say, what is it that makes you think that you might not get into heaven? What is it that gives you that thought? And allow the person to respond to that, and then open up the conversation about, well, what do you think heaven is like? Do you think actually that sometimes the way in which we think about the afterlife is much more our own construct than the way in which it actually is? Don't you think that God might be rather more generous to us than we're willing to allow him to be? And to enable people, I think, to explore and ask questions that are appropriate for them, and to feel that they've never had the question just batted off as if it's a nuisance to ask it. Because if they're asking it for a reason, and it deserves a response. People have big questions whether there is a religious belief in the background or not. And I can think of a family one afternoon, a hot Saturday afternoon, I was called in to see a couple where the husband had been diagnosed a matter of a few weeks before with his terminal disease. He'd been admitted the night before I was called in to see him on the afternoon, and he was actively dying. So his breathing was very rapid, his pulse was very weak. It was clear that he had hours to live, and his wife was with him, and she was sitting to one, facing him, to one sort of at an angle to the bed, not holding his hand, with no physical contact. And when I came into the room, it was an odd dynamic between the two of them. She was obviously very distressed by what she was witnessing. He was dying and not responsive. So I sort of put a chair in between the two of them. I made a sort of triangle, if you like. And his wife just talked about the loss that all of his death would mean. So the fact that they were in their mid-40s, becoming more independent in life, having some money to spend to go on holiday and do things together that they'd not been able to do before, planning for a future together, know that their child was an adult and able to be independent of them and not reliant on them. So they were looking at how they could make things different for them, and in terms of what they wanted to do, and choose for themselves the things that they wanted to do. How in terms of work, they might think about what was important and how much time they would spend in work as opposed to with each other. And all of the things that she just spilled out, really, were big questions, big losses. And I had no idea what to say at all. I felt a little bit lost. And after she had sort of concluded, and there had been a moment or two of silence between us, all I could say was, "It sounds to me like you've been robbed of your future." And although she continued to cry and still be very upset, the acknowledgement of the loss that was coming, for her, in terms of the big questions about what my life is going to be without this man who's been my husband for X years, was so huge that just having that acknowledged for her enabled her then to move on and in the conversation to talk a bit more about what I will do when he's no longer here. So, there are huge questions that people ask, not just the patients themselves who are approaching the end of their life, but I think the ones who travel with them in the journey towards death, the ones who will survive the death and go on into bereavement and have to adjust and readjust and make a life that's different and not planned. And unless we're willing to hear and answer the big questions that come out of that life that's different and not planned, we're not doing our job properly. None of us are doing our job properly. So there are huge questions, I think, that come up. And, the one around, is there a heaven, is frequently asked. Is there a God? What have I done to deserve this? I was talking with somebody fairly recently who wanted to reflect not only on their own terminal disease, but also on some of the other awfulness as they perceived it in the world. So the situation in Syria, the death of 50 people in a shooting in America, the murder in the street of an MP, and actually put into context of their own dying and own end of life, all of these other terrible things, and ask questions about why are we here if life seems so awful for everybody. And that was a really difficult conversation for me to have, because she wanted to have the meta-narrative conversation about suffering and evil in the world, as well as the micro-narrative conversation about my life and death. But actually to have simply said something very glib about the meta-narrative, well, of course, we don't need to think about that now, let's just concentrate on you, would have been to dismiss what for her were very real issues about faith and belief, about life and death, because she was putting into the context of her own life and death suffering and evil, which she saw on a bigger scale. And I'm not sure, if I'm honest, I answered all the questions that she had, but I am sure that at least I was able to sit with her while we had the conversation. And I'm sure that that was helpful to her.